to everybody. So you guys will get that, but others will also. You'll get you'll be able to look at the thing later and refer other folks to it. And then we'll have some other supporting information. Um, if you have questions during the show, please put them in the Q&A section. And in general, we'll try to wait till a little bit later to get those, but we'll see how that goes. I'll just introduce the other folks that are here: Kylie McClatchy and Shay Utzinger from Wild Virginia. And then I'll introduce Jackie Goodrum, who's going to start off the show here with a little bit of explanation about what PFAS is. So take it away, Jackie.
Thanks, Dave. So my name is Jacqueline Goodrum, and Dave and I have been working on this issue together, and we are going to provide you first with a background and overview of the problem of PFAS pollution. Then Dave will talk about the solution and specifically Wild Virginia's campaign to stop PFAS pollution at its source, and then we'll take questions. So next slide. So the problem, PFAS pollution. So recently it has become public knowledge through scientific studies and class action lawsuits that our environment and particularly our waters have been widely polluted and continues to be polluted with toxic chemicals known as PFAS. This pollution is widespread and has contaminated water, soil, air, wildlife, and even our own bodies. Next slide. So what are PFAS? PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're a class of toxic human-made chemicals that have been used in manufacturing since the 1940s. They are persistent, meaning that they linger in the environment, taking so long to break down that they've earned the name forever chemicals. PFAS are bioaccumulative, meaning that they build up in the bodies of humans and wildlife, and they're also mobile, meaning that they move easily within water and air. There are thousands of types of PFAS. Some older forms have been phased out by the EPA after their hazardous characteristics were discovered within the past couple of decades. But there are still thousands of types of PFAS out there today and being used in everyday products and being discharged into our waters. Next slide. So why are PFAS concerning? I've described them as toxic, as hazardous. Well, it's well established through scientific study that PFAS exposure, even at low levels, can have significant harmful impacts on human health. And these studies are both of observational studies of humans who have been exposed, as well as animal studies of PFAS exposure in mice or rats. This is important because PFAS pollution is widespread and it makes it difficult to totally avoid exposure. Some of the harmful health effects include decreased fertility or reproductive issues, high blood pressure or risk of preeclampsia during pregnancy, developmental effects or delays in children, including lower birth rate and size, as well as behavioral changes, increased risk of some cancers, including kidney, testicular, and liver, prostate and liver cancers, liver malfunction, hyperthyroidism, colitis, as well as the reduced ability of the body's immune system to fight infections, including a reduced vaccine uptake when you receive a vaccine. PFAS also interfere with the body's natural hormones because they are endocrine disruptors. Increased cholesterol and increased risk for obesity is also a harmful health effect that has been established to have connections to PFAS exposure, as well as exacerbated effects or symptoms from COVID-19. Additionally, it's important to note that some communities are impacted by these health impacts more widely and heavily than other communities because they are more heavily exposed to PFAS. Perhaps it's in their drinking water, or they're a community made up of individuals who work in an industry where PFAS is used. Next slide. So at Wild Virginia, we also care about wildlife, and PFAS are also concerning for wildlife. Wildlife exposed to PFAS also present negative health effects, including increased incidence of disease, cancers, lower reproductive success, and liver issues. And so we have been comparing this to DDT because PFAS has the potential to silence the woods and our waters by harming these species by diminishing their ability to survive. We know that PFAS also harms wildlife from observational studies of creatures that have been found in waters, particularly rivers and coastal areas where PFAS has contaminated the water. So amphibians, fish, shellfish, mollusks, other aquatic invertebrates are particularly susceptible to harms from PFAS, as well as birds that prey on a lot of these smaller animals. There's some studies have found that just birds in certain areas, including off the coast of Maine, are just full of PFAS from eating fish and shellfish that are contaminated with PFAS. Next slide. So how does PFAS exposure occur? For wildlife, it's either being in the water, it's in their environment, or they're eating other animals that have been contaminated with PFAS, or they're eating contaminated forage. For people, PFAS can be found in many places, including air, water, soil, and food, as well as our home and workplaces. And for this reason, we can be exposed to PFAS through a variety of pathways. Contaminated drinking water is a significant source of PFAS exposure, as well as ingestion of contaminated food, perhaps the crops that you're eating. That farm used sewage sludge, land applied biosolids, which contain PFAS. And so now that food is contaminated with PFAS, and then we're ingesting it. There's also exposure through food by food that comes in grease-resistant food wrappers, like something you get from a fast food restaurant. That's another pathway of exposure, as well as nonstick cookware. If we're cooking in pans that are coated with a nonstick surface, it used to be Teflon, Teflon was a PFAS, then that is another way that PFAS can get into our food. Also eating contaminated fish and shellfish. These animals suffer, and then we can also suffer harmful effects by eating these wildlife that are contaminated with PFAS. Also working in certain occupations such as firefighting or chemicals manufacturing, or being members of the military, these groups have higher levels of PFAS exposure and more harmful health effects as a result. And so for Wild Virginia's campaign, we are focusing on water pollution as a major pathway of exposure, and Dave will discuss this further on. Next slide. So I've mentioned a few products that contain PFAS because it's in a lot of consumer products. It is around us, it's in our environment at home, as well as at work and out and about. So nonstick cookware, stain-resistant carpet, upholstery and fabrics, grease-resistant food wrappers and containers, waterproof outdoor gear, cosmetics, it's in waterproof mascara, synthetic field turf, and firefighting foam used at airports, military bases, and on naval ships. And so this just gives you a look into the wide variety of products that contain PFAS, the producers and industrial dischargers that are creating these products and then discharging the pollution into our waterways that Dave will talk more about. Next slide. So you might be feeling a little overwhelmed learning about how many products contain PFAS and how widespread the contamination is. And so I want to give you a few micro level things that you can do, actions that you can take in your home to reduce your PFAS exposure and that of your family or any loved ones. And then Dave will talk about, when he's talking about Wild Virginia's campaign and our solution to this problem, he'll talk about the big macro level actions that we're going to be taking. So how you can reduce your exposure. One way that's really easy is get outside. Inhaling contaminated air and dust inside our homes is also a major pathway of PFAS exposure. If our homes contain carpets or upholstery or fabrics or furniture that have been treated with water resistant or stain resistant coatings, these coatings contain PFAS, and therefore they're off-gassing into our home environment, and we're inhaling the chemicals that way. And so getting outside is one way. 90% of North Americans spend 90% of their time inside. And so if we can decrease the amount we're spending decrease the amount we're spending inside and spend more time outside, then we can minimize our exposure to PFAS in that way. Another way to reduce your risk of PFAS exposure is to filter your drinking water. Wastewater treatment plants, the conventional technology that they have does not filter PFAS out of drinking water. So if you do not have filtered water, Brita filters do not do that either. You need a granulated carbon filter. You can look this up online, but there are particular filters that are available that will filter PFAS out of your drinking water. So you can consider installing one of those in your home if you're able to. Reducing or eliminating fish or shellfish consumption. In Virginia, currently, we do not have fish consumption advisors for PFAS. So that is something to be aware of when you are choosing to eat fish or shellfish. If you do, in Virginia, some states, Maine is one example, as well as Michigan, have these advisories for fish, shellfish, and game. So until we have those for fish and shellfish in Virginia, we just don't know. Certain water bodies we do know from water sampling testing done by DEQ and universities. We know where there are certain pockets of PFAS contamination from certain rivers, and so the fish that come from those places would not be the best to eat. So one of the things you can do to reduce your exposure is just reducing or eliminating fish and shellfish from your diet. You can also reduce or eliminate your use of nonstick cookware. Maybe if you have a pan that's scratched, it's time to get rid of it so that the coating definitely isn't leaching into your food. If you're able to gradually replace or entirely replace, that's also something you can do. And you can look online. Many manufacturers of major cookware brands now have an FAQ section where they list whether or not their products contain PFAS. I was able to do a quick Google and learn which of my brands had PFAS and which ones did not. You can also reduce or eliminate the use of grease-resistant food containers or wrappers. Maybe this means if you're going to get takeout, there's a way that you can bring a reusable glass or metal container with you. If you're ordering takeout, going and grabbing that coffee, the coffee lining inside the cup contains PFAS. Maybe you can bring, again, a reusable cup, or it's just reduce the number of times that you're doing that in a week or a month, and that can gradually reduce your PFAS exposure. Knowing your farmer is another way. Do you know who grows your fruits and vegetables? Do you know whether they use sewage sludge land applied biosolids as a fertilizer on their crops, or if someone has in the past? That would be a question to ask. So that's another way you can reduce PFAS exposure, is just knowing where your fruit and vegetables are coming from, your meat and dairy as well, and whether or not sewage sludge is involved in making them grow. Swapping your cosmetics and outdoor gear if possible. Many outdoor gear companies have pledged to eliminate their use of PFAS by 2025 and are looking at alternatives that are not supposed to be PFAS. There are other types of toxic chemicals. So if you're able to afford to replace your gear at that time, that would be a way to reduce your exposure. Swapping your cosmetics, swapping out that waterproof mascara, and just getting used to sweating and having a little bit of smudging is something else you can do. And finally, avoiding skin contact with synthetic turf, as PFAS is used in the manufacturing process of that product. Next slide. All right, so now that I've talked about all the terrible things about PFAS and given you the context from where we're coming from for this campaign, Dave is going to talk about what can be done on the macro level about it. Take it away, Dave.
Thanks, Jackie. You know, one thing that did occur to me in talking about all the products and what you buy and what people are producing is sometimes it's a really good idea to let people who are doing the right thing, people who are changing their products or whatever, let them know you appreciate it. And for others, let them know they should be doing the same thing. Just a little thing that I try to do to to get people thinking about it. Anyhow, so while Virginia saw what a big problem this was, probably a year and a half, 2 years ago, we started thinking about it seriously. And as you just heard from Jackie, this stuff seems like it's everywhere. There's so many things to think about in relation to dealing with it. But we wanted to come up with a focused program that people could be involved with, that you can join us in, and that we believe can get real results. Oh, let me go back and just say that we kind of break it into three parts, although they overlap. The first part is to really be involved in the regulatory process, how the state of Virginia, especially, and to some degree EPA, are looking at these problems and how they're addressing them with the authorities they have or with new authorities. There may be a place for new legislation, new policies on top of what's already there, and we're thinking about that. And then finally, we have to educate everybody. You by attending this webinar will instantly know more than an awful lot of your neighbors. You will know more than a lot of the decision makers probably at the end of this hour. So it's going to have to be a continuous effort to educate folks, because otherwise it's hard to get those policy changes or those regulatory actions. But the big message to me is that Virginia does have the ability, the authority to act in some ways now. And despite the complexity of the issues, despite the concern that it's all over the place, there are some targeted things they can do, and we're going to insist they do it. And we're asking you to join us in making that case. As I say, it's such a big issue. We don't know enough about the specific health impacts or the levels that are most dangerous. We don't know enough about all the sources yet. We know a lot that's scary, but we'll be learning for decades probably. Again, it seems to be everywhere, including in our own cells and those of wildlife. And once it gets into the environment, it can be really hard to remove. It can be expensive. The technical challenges of how to remove it, as Jackie was saying, even with your drinking water, you had to have the right kind of filter to deal with it. But really, to me, one of the biggest problems with a huge issue like this is the concern that people will see how big it is, how kind of scary it is, and just say, well, what can I do? And I think that can be a risk with a lot of problems. I hear that with people when they talk about climate change. Well, it's huge. What can I do? And the fact is, there are always things that we can do, as Jackie explained, kind of on the micro level, the choices we make day to day, but also in how we act as participants in our government system. And that's where I start. As I say, there are authorities that the state of Virginia has right now that they need to be exercising. In fact, we believe they have a duty to do some things that they're just not doing so far. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of their approach. But again, we know those things are possible. We know they should be happening now. And there is no need to wait for us to get all the information. Where they call that analysis paralysis. We could just sit and think about, what we don't know and put off making actions. But that's not an acceptable approach. And we know, while Virginia has a lot of practice advocating with agencies and trying to get them to do the things that they have a duty to do, and again, we're asking you to join us in those efforts. As we go forward, we're going to give people the chance and specific information about how to join in and how to support what we're trying to do. Okay. So specifically, when I say that Virginia has the power to do some things right now, there are regulatory programs specifically for discharges, wastewater that comes from your town sewage treatment plant or comes from the factory down the road. All of those discharges, if they're going to be allowed to operate, have to get a permit from the state of Virginia. And so there's the ability to regulate what they do, how they do, and when they do it. And there are thousands of those across the state. So if you're looking for risk of new PFAS in our environment, new PFAS threats to us, that's one of the big places you need to look. As Jackie said, one of the ways we come into contact with it is through water, one of the biggest ways, whether we're using streams, whether we're drinking water, whether we're using groundwater on areas that have been where it's been land applied, where things have been land applied. So that's a big target, and it can be a very useful and very efficient one to stop a lot of the problems before they get really bad. In doing this permitting process, issuing permits, first of all, remember that if I apply for a permit to discharge to our streams and they're ours, I don't have the right to do that. I'm being given the opportunity to do it, but along with that go real responsibilities for me and for my activities. One of the requirements is that every discharge is supposed to make sure that it does not cause violations of our water quality standards. Those standards describe what our waters are supposed to look like, the quality that's supposed to be maintained so that we can use them, so that they're sustainable, so that aquatic life can survive, and so the whole system works. And again, before somebody is issued one of those permits, they can and should be required to identify the pollution that's in that discharge. We know that there are a range of pollutants that come through factories, that come through wastewater treatment systems. The first step is to know what they are and how much is there. And then the next step, once you know that, is to control the release of those pollutants, keep them out of the environment. And as Jackie also said, these substances can be dangerous in such small amounts that it's really difficult, really impossible to say, it's okay to put out this much. What we really need to do is be eliminating it. The other way, besides those discharges, usually through a pipe into a stream, the other way that is very prevalent that these substances get into the environment is through what some people call biosolids. Essentially, what it is a mixture of solid, liquid kind of materials that are taken out when wastewater is treated. So say a factory discharges its water to a wastewater plant, a treatment system, is used to keep that final water that goes into the stream from having all the pollutants. That means you're taking out things, and to some degree that's solid materials and other materials. So you got to do something with that. Unfortunately, one of the things that's done right now is that those biosolids, or that sewage sludge, is spread all over farm fields. Hundreds of acres, thousands of acres in Virginia receive these biosolids, or this sludge, as a form of fertilizer. And I can understand that farmers sometimes feel like it's a valuable thing for them that keeps them from having to buy commercial fertilizer. But at the same time, we know that that sewage sludge, in many cases, is likely to have PFAS in it. So when you're spreading it, you're releasing it to the land and very often to the water, both the groundwater when it seeps into the ground and to the streams nearby. So back to this idea of the water quality standards. Please don't try to read all that and understand it all right away. It's too many words for a slide, but I did want you to understand that there is this thing called our narrative water quality criteria that gives you a description of one way that we're supposed to look at water quality. Now, just to give you the converse, there is something called numeric water quality criteria. And when we know how much of a substance is really dangerous and how much might not be so bad, we can set a number, and that helps us to control the discharge of those pollutants. As you're hearing, PFAS is something we're just quickly learning about. There are thousands of forms of it, and we do not have numeric criteria that make it easy one by one to control, and we probably never will have numeric criteria for all those thousands of substances. Still, we can figure out when we're causing threats and damage. And this narrative criteria is how we decide whether we're doing enough, whether we're controlling it appropriately. And the part that I have highlighted there, we're not supposed to allow discharges. The state of Virginia is not supposed to allow any discharge that will cause conditions that are inimical, which is a word I don't use very often, or harmful to humans, animals, plants, any of the wildlife that are exposed. And that is a basis for controlling PFAS. And you don't have to take my word for it. Other states have already done it. State of North Carolina, state of Michigan, others are developing other regulatory mechanisms. So it's not as if it can't be done. It must be done. So one of the problems, again, is where is this stuff? How's it getting into the environment? Who's releasing it through wastewater or biosolids and sludge? We have a very limited amount of data, to be honest, in Virginia. Much too limited, to tell you the truth. There are other states that have a much better database already. But I thought I'd tell you about some of the examples. DEQ and the state health department have done monitoring to some degree on public water supplies. There is some monitoring of water, fish, sediments in streams, but it's pretty limited. Now, the three places I've listed here are just ones, frankly, that have popped up in the news, and you may have heard of others already, but the Roanoke area incident is one that I think is really a good illustration of why we need to do something now, why we should not wait. What happened there is that the huge water supply reservoir, which serves parts of Roanoke County, Roanoke City, other nearby localities, when it was tested, it was found that they had the highest, or some of the highest, PFAS numbers of any water supply in the state. And so they had to figure out where that was coming from. What they did is they started tracing back upstream. They found that the highest levels were near a discharge, one of those municipal wastewater treatment plants that I've discussed. They then went further and said, okay, how did these things get into this wastewater plant so they would be discharged? And there was an industrial facility that was found to have been handling these materials. So that was a good little detective job they did there. They traced it back up. But one of the things that struck me about it is, again, how pernicious this stuff is, yeah, and how it can last. The place where this was released into a stream was many, many miles upstream of this reservoir and of the place where it was found. And so, what for some pollutants might have, it might have dispersed, it might have broken down by then. Again, because of the unique nature of these things, it doesn't go away. They are still in that water supply reservoir finding PFAS. And the fact is that it binds to the sediments, it does accumulate in fish, and it's just not going to go away quickly. The Chickahominy River, they found some really serious problems there. Rivanna River, which is near where I live here, and some of us live near Charlottesville. And in some of those cases, they have not found the cause. They haven't found the original source. Now, the Roanoke example, let's go back to that. Once the wastewater or the water authority there, the one that issue or that supplies drinking water to homes, once they figured it out, they did fairly quickly commit to doing something about it. They're going to spend millions of dollars putting in an adequate treatment system that will remove the PFAS before it comes out your tap if you're one of those customers. But that's not the best way to do it. First of all, it's a lot of money, it's difficulty. And so that's not the right way to address this. And one of the focuses has been on, let's go sample more water supplies, more drinking water supplies. Well, we should do that, but we shouldn't wait to see those results. Again, let's not put off the real effective actions. What we have to do is go all the way back to the source. We have to stop it before it gets to the point where we got to then try to take it out. One of the things that we have started to look at, let's see, let me go back. One of the things we've started to look at through what I call this regulatory approach is the permits that the state does issue. And we've joined with people like Southern Environmental Law Center, James River Association, and started to file comments and challenge whether the permits that DEQ is putting out are good enough. And the fact is, so far, they're not, because we've identified places where we either know there's going to be PFAS there because of the kind of industries that exist, or there's a good chance. And what we've said to DEQ is, you got to require sampling. You got to require those things to be identified before you issue this permit. And you have to put conditions in that permit that will deal with it. So far, DEQ's response has been, we're kind of waiting on EPA to tell us what to do. That's a rough paraphrase, but that's essentially it. And again, that's not acceptable. That's just not something that we're going to kind of rely on, because we don't know how long that will be. And we need not wait. One of the other things that we have started to do is not just wait for when permits come up for issuance and when DEQ asks for our opinion. We're looking in the future, and we're picking some of the discharges that we know will be looked at in the next year or more. And we're going to start advocating both with DEQ and with EPA in its oversight role that they start early in the process. When an application is first filed, that they say you don't have a complete application if you don't give us this information. So go back to what I said about the regulatory approach, the policy and legislative approach. We're also kind of seeing how much ground do we make with the regulatory approach. Do we need to call on legislators to step in and say, hey, you're not doing it. Let's take this next step. Um, and then finally, this effort tonight and an ongoing effort that we're going to have for probably years to come is to continue the education, to continue to tell people what the problem is and how they can do something about it. And as I say, one of the most effective things you can do is follow us. And we'll tell you when there's a chance you can jump in. You can, you might sign a petition, you might join us in contacting legislators or members of the State Water Control Board or whatever. But we're looking for the pressure points. We're going to help you find where those are and how to be effective. So I'm going to stop there. And Shay, you want to help us figure out what people want to know here?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the first questions we could start with is whether any town and city water treatment plants report PFAS as they might other substances of concerns.
Okay. I'm not, well, first of all, let's go back to the Roanoke example. They found they had PFAS in their water supply reservoir, and I'm not sure of all the sequence of events, but they did not immediately let their customers know. I know that some citizens in the area found out, a reporter found out, and somewhere after a number of months, they told their customers. Here in Charlottesville area, the Ravenna Sewer Authority, once they found it in a stream in a water supply area, I don't think they delayed. I'm not sure what the time frame was. So we're starting to get that kind of notification. The problem again, when it's not an established kind of thing with specific amounts, they don't necessarily immediately feel like they have to tell their customers, but they should. As soon as they find it, the general public and their customers should be told. Is there anything that you could add about that, Jackie, that
I was just going to add that thus far there's not an official legal requirement that they notify. That is something that a couple other groups that we work with on this issue have been talking about, particularly one group down around near Roanoke. They would like it to be a legal requirement that if there's PFAS found, that the customers have to be notified immediately. And I'll just use, I also live near Charlottesville, like Dave. In the Ravenna River PFAS situation, I believe they made it public very quickly, but that's because this was fairly recent. It was only like a couple months ago, and already other water authorities had gotten in public trouble for not letting their customers know right away.
which again tells you the value of making some noise and asking some questions. If you have a water supplier, why not ask them? Have you been doing this testing? If you've been doing it, what are you finding? So, what do they say about the squeaky wheel? We want to be squeaky. Okay, what's next?
Yeah, while we're kind of on the topic of Roanoke, Anne had a question about why, if Roanoke found the apparent industrial source, why they didn't immediately go after that.
Well, I think the thing was that it was kind of an episodic thing. This facility, what they had done is they were doing maintenance and cleaning on some heavy equipment that came from another factory. That factory has PFAS as one of the things that's part of its its industrial process and its products. So when it was brought to this local facility, I don't think they knew that PFAS was involved. So they worked on it. They cleaned it. They repaired the machinery or whatever it was. And I don't think there's any indication that that was going to be a continuing source from that specific facility. I know that the folks who own that facility were pretty unhappy with the industry that sent them this dirty equipment, this stuff that was already contaminated. But um, I think that was the rare occurrence where it was a short-term thing but it was enough to cause significant contamination. If it was an industrial process where this was just part of them making products, then they would have to make some significant changes to their operation to stop it. And that's what we need to insist on where it's necessary. Okay. What else we got?
Yeah. Susan was curious about how PFAS is actually removed from water at a water treatment plant.
Yeah. Basically what they call activated carbon. It's, it removes a lot of stuff, to be honest, because of the nature of the substance, the carbon. It has certain charges, electrical charges, and things bind to it. So that's what they're doing at that Roanoke system. As I say, I keep wanting to say 35 million, but I'm not sure that's correct. It might be 3.5 million. Anyway, it's a bunch of millions, more than I'm usually thinking about. It's expensive stuff. And even once you put it in, you have to clean that carbon. You have to replace it. So it's not a one-time easy thing. But as far as we know, it does work. At least it takes it down to levels that we can no longer detect the PFAS. I don't know of any other really effective ways. I haven't heard of any.
Yeah, another question here is how difficult and how expensive is PFAS to test for?
I don't know how expensive. Jackie might know something about that. I don't know how much a sample costs. There are methods. Now, one of DEQ's excuses for not requiring sampling as a regular basis is that, again, we're still working with some methods that are being kind of perfected and approved. But we know there are methods that work. I don't think actually collecting the samples or running the samples, the analysis is no harder than a lot of other kind of chemicals, organic chemicals and things like that. So that's not the holdup. I think a big part of it is, since it's new, what is the most effective and efficient way to do the sampling. Now, you go back to the idea that there are thousands of these. We do not have tests to measure 5,000 or more of them individually. The list that EPA specifically talks about is like 40 of these substances. So we do know something about measuring that set of substances. There are also methods to measure the aggregate, or an estimate of the aggregate of the PFAS, the different forms. It's still being perfected, but we do know how to do it. And, it's not as if anybody is saying you got to do hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of samples, right away. So it's doable. That's the bottom line, and it's necessary.
I don't have an exact idea on the cost, but for example, in phase 1 of the Virginia Department of Health's drinking water study, they were allocated $60,000 from the General Assembly, which is not a lot of money at all. And they were able to process 68 drinking water sites. They are in the process of completing a phase 2 of the drinking water sampling study, where they're sampling over 200 sites throughout the Commonwealth. So it's a much more robust and thorough study. And they were, I believe they got some EPA grant money to apply to that.
And two things in relation to that. One is that when we're talking about this with legislators or with decision makers, one thing we will be advocating is you do provide money so that the health department and DEQ can do monitoring. The other part of that, though, is that, again, these regulated parties need to be part of that picture. You and I, our tax dollars can go for monitoring, but at the same time, these parties that are having the privilege to discharge to our waters should also be paying to complete that picture. Okay, what else?
Yeah, there are some more questions about the at-home filters, and then also where and how that activated charcoal with PFAS might be disposed of after.
I'll let you take the first part of that, Jackie, and I'll try to
Sure,
deal
it's
with
the
this.
same sort of filter, just on a smaller scale. It's a granular activated carbon filter. You can buy them at Home Depot. I just did a quick Google search, and EPA has an article talking about how well they work, as well as Duke's School of the Environment, how they work for filtering out drinking water. And with respect to the disposal on the large scale, that is a complicated and good question. And I will note that in regards to the Roanoke water treatment plant that Dave has been talking about, this case study, the cost of having to dispose of the carbon filters has increased their operating costs, as well as the transportation contributing to climate change by increasing greenhouse gas emissions coming from this project. But Dave, you want to speak more to the disposal?
Right. And, this just amplifies the reason we don't want to get it there to begin with, because it is costly. I don't know how much activated carbon is involved in the filters that the Roanoke operation have, but I'm sure it's a pretty significant amount. To some degree, what you can do is you can kind of flush those filters and kind of reactivate them. In other words, you kind of recharge them. But the water that you take out has to then be cycled back through so you can continue to have treatment. But in the end, a lot of that carbon is going to end up in landfills. There may be ways to treat it with heat or something like that, but I don't know how effective that is with PFAS on the carbon itself. But it is important. Now, the thing about putting it in a landfill, that too involves managing water. The good thing about most of our modern landfills is that they collect the water that seeps from the waste, and they continue to recycle and treat that. There are no good options here, to be honest, once it gets into the environment and once you have to take those steps. And that's why, again, I harp on, let's keep it from getting there. What else?
Yeah, Alice was curious at kind of what rate over time PFAS is being found in our water.
I think the more we look, the more we find it. It is as simple as it gets. And I'll be honest, I think that's part of the reason that some people don't want to do a lot more testing is they're worried about what we're going to find. I don't know. You want to add to that, Jackie?
I do not know the rate over time. I am not a technical person, but I do agree that the more you sample, the more you're going to find it, which is why in Virginia you have the health department taking it on and doing more sampling than the Department of Environmental Quality.
I'll say we looked at some other states. For example, South Carolina has lots and lots of monitoring sites around the state, and they're finding it almost everywhere. So it is a scary picture. Okay.
Yeah. Do you all know if anyone has prioritized kind of the known PFAS chemicals for danger or harmful effects? There's just a comment that legislators probably will want to know which ones to write legislation about to eliminate.
EPA has proposed a rule where they are focusing on targeting 12 PFAS first for regulation. However, this is something that West Virginia signed on to oppose along with our partners at SCLC and James River Association because there are just thousands of them. We want them regulated as a class. And so we would want legislators to write any kind of legislation regulating them as a class, not just as individual PFAS.
And, you know, Jackie mentioned earlier that there are a couple of forms that manufacturers, people have said they're not going to use anymore, but clearly that hasn't solved the problem. You know, and doing them one at a time makes no sense because they are a huge group that we have to be concerned about the aggregate of all of them. Okay.
Yeah, there's also some curiosity about how PFAS gets into sewage sludge to start off with, and if that has anything to do with livestock feed or grass or.
Well, again, if it's in the wastewater, you know, when you treat that wastewater, one of the things, as I say, you do is you remove solid materials. This stuff, some forms of PFAS, probably most of them, can bind to solid materials. They certainly bind to sediments in streams. And I'm sure they bind to some of those materials. And again, that's what makes up sludge. It's kind of a slurry of solids and some percentage of fluids. And so in cleaning some of it from the wastewater discharge, it's kind of like with the filters. You're taking some out and then you got to take that somewhere and deal with it. But I think it's that binding to those solids is kind of the key there.
Awesome. Yeah. There's also a question about what kind of studies have been done to look at the effects of PFAS on wildlife.
Jackie knows a lot about that.
Sure. So most of these have been observational studies in that certain species that have been found around contaminated sites have had noticeable deformities or lesions on their bodies, so, specifically frogs, different types of fish. And that has led scientists to then study the animal and test it for PFAS. And then there have also been animal studies on lab rats, lab mice, exposing them to various types of PFAS and seeing what happens. I can put a particular article, a scientific article I just pulled up from NIH's repository in the chat reference.
Yeah, that's great. And then I think going off of this, kind of talking about fish and shellfish that might be contaminated. Anne was curious how to tell or know if fish or shellfish might be contaminated.
Sure. So in most instances, you cannot tell. If you are fishing near a contaminated site, for example, like the DuPont factory that's on the James River just south of Richmond, and you're finding creatures that look unusual or odd or sick or deformed, then that would be one clue. But for the most part, we don't know because there's no, unless they are being exposed to high levels in a short period of time, we're more likely to see it over a longer period of time as it lingers and as they accumulate and bioaccumulate exposure. So for the most part, we don't know. And so one rule of thumb is just to avoid eating it completely until we have some kind of advisory in place.
Got it. There's just a few more questions. One last one was, what are the qualities of PFAS that make them so useful and widely used?
Chemically, you know, and I'm not a chemist, but they have really strong bonds. The components, the molecules that make up the different kinds of PFAS, they hold together very well. And those strong bonds give it the characteristics of, you know, being resistant to water, being resistant to breaking down, versus something that's more unstable, a kind of chemical that can degrade quickly. And that's as good of a chemical explanation as I can give on anything.
Yeah, there's also one question over in the chat about you mentioned sheets earlier, and were you talking about maybe manufacturer safety data sheets? I'm not totally sure.
I'm not sure what that
Sure.
sheets. I'm not sure.
Sounds good.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Sorry, I'm just checking the chat for last questions that are coming in.
We appreciate that.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you guys asking so many questions. You're testing us here, but
they're great questions.
but
Yeah, there's one in the chat about if there's a test that kind of the average person could test the water at their own home. Someone here is a teacher and is curious about having their students test their well water. And it seems like they might be in the Roanoke area.
I suggest getting in touch with Virginia Tech has a research group, in their Water Resources Institute, and it's a group of scientists who have been testing for PFAS in well water throughout Virginia as part of a grant-funded study that they have. So I would get in touch with them and see about putting their link in the chat and just see. I know they were mailing tests to people about 9 months ago or something.
Yeah. You want to have real specialists who do the actual you know, analysis, because it's a fairly sophisticated process.
Kind of the continued part of their question, I think, is also if, as someone part of a watershed downstream from Roanoke, so like downstream of where PFAS might have been found, if they could also be affected.
Well, you know, they have now found it in Smith Mountain Lake, which is way downstream from Roanoke. And so, yeah, there's real concern there. And as I say, the fact that it can bind to sediments means, especially for an impoundment or a reservoir like that, that you may have it in those sediments and continue to circulate. Any
Yeah, we just had a question come in from Mary about if you know anything about what other countries might be doing or might be dealing with PFAS problems, and if they have any insight for us on how to dispose of it or regulate it.
I have done less looking at in international than I have within the U.S., but I don't know. Can you add anything about that, Jackie?
I have not done much research on what other countries are doing, but other countries are dealing with PFAS as well. We have mostly been doing research on what other states are doing, given that a big part of our focus is using the tools that we already have under the Clean Water Act to try to influence Virginia to get its act together and do something, because this is what other states are doing: Michigan, North Carolina, Colorado. Other states in the Great Lakes are looking at creating water quality standards for PFAS, as well as in New England. So we've mostly been looking at what other states have been doing, given that we have generally the same regulatory regime and also the same regulatory approach. I would love to say that we could look to Europe or the European Union, but a lot of times they operate on a precautionary principle rather than reacting to things like we do in the US.
Right. The one thing I'll say is that if you start looking at the literature about where it's being found and how it's being found, that is universal for sure. You can find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers really quickly. So everybody's looking at it. Okay, we're about at time. Is there one more burning one you see there, or are we pretty good?
I think these are all pretty much all the questions that have come in. We've
Okay,
gotten to.
great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all again for being so active and inquisitive. Again, we follow up with this. This is being recorded, has been recorded, so it'll be available. We'll make sure you have the links for that. If there's other people you want to refer to it, they can watch it later. And there's plenty of information, but again, follow us. We're going to be on this case for quite some time, and we're going to help you figure out how you can plug into it and be effective as an advocate. So thank you all, and good night.